I guess we'll start now. Thank you for coming today. And first, I'm Aiko. I'm the admin for the session. I'm from Japan. And now I'll introduce Ryan. Access to education is a challenge globally. While only 25% of the world has the high-speed internet access to an online course, over 70% have access to messaging like SMS and WhatsApp. Ryan, the co-founder of Arist, will speak about how his company has built tools used by nonprofits and multinational companies to teach via popular messaging tools. Ryan, you have the floor now.
Perfect. Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much, Aiko, and hope this is useful for folks both watching and will watch the recording after. So let me just share my screen super briefly here. Awesome. Perfect. And I'll assume everyone can see it. Of course, let me know if not. So essentially, like Aiko mentioned, a lot of what we'll be talking about today is how to make learning accessible via SMS and WhatsApp. So a few things that I'll cover, and I'll make sure to leave time for plenty of time for questions at the end too. Who I am and why I'm here, the challenges that we face with learning globally, how the way we learn is shifting just kind of on a broader scale, what the research says about how to create effective and accessible learning, and how we can make learning accessible today. And so first, who am I and why am I here? A lot of this story really goes back to a few years ago. This was me. I was as part of a program teaching in Tanzania. And so I was doing a lot of entrepreneurship education and primarily just really involved with the kind of the whole premise of how do we increase access to education to those who might not have it. And it was a pretty interesting trajectory from here. This was about 2 or 3 years ago. I was a student in college at the time. I was also running a organization that did a lot of public speaking coaching and training. And so that was the company I was running then. And so I was very in the world of learning design. I was pretty young as well, and was really just kind of fascinated with this idea of increasing access to education. And I had this question of, why isn't learning accessible for everyone? How can we work to make it more accessible? And so, around this time is when I started to become, become really fascinated with how people were actually learning. Currently, there are only 3 options for learning. There's video learning, e-learning modules, or primarily in-person training. And those are usually the 3 different ways that folks had, especially pre-COVID, but even now, to actually get access to education. And for many of them, it just was not working well. So this is the percentage of individuals who are using the internet globally. And so when you think about e-learning modules or things that are really video intensive, I was looking at this and thinking, okay, it's clearly something's not working here. Around the same time, one of my now co-founders was working with students in the Yemeni war zone through a nonprofit. And he was working with a student named Mohammed, whose picture you see here, and was getting messages from Mohammed about, who was in Yemen at the time, the Yemeni education system is down. There's no way to actually receive any educational materials. And it was actually in this message, he said, okay, 24% of the population use internet, according to 2017 statistics. This was back in 2017. Internet speed is very slow. We can't download a video. And so my now co-founder, who was running this organization at the time, texted back and said, how many students have access to texting, to WhatsApp, to cellular? We can send the reading materials in Arabic through text. And this was a lot of the genesis of this idea. And it was really fascinating, again, when we came together to discuss what even this would look like, because I had been in that world of learning and training design, of trying to increase access to education. And he had been more enthralled kind of with the nonprofit space and was really fascinated by that as well. And so this kind of begs the big question for us of what happens if we send materials over text. So this is the comparatively to the chart I just showed you with internet usage rates. And this is probably not a surprise to most of you. This is the forecasted mobile phone usage rates worldwide. And so you see here, for 2020, about 6.9 billion people projected to have either access to mobile phones directly, or they have someone nearby where they can access their mobile phone. And so this is, a significant percentage of the global population. We like to think at least 75% of people around the world can access mobile phones, but a lot of different stats based on how it's measured actually bring that closer to 80, 90, or even greater than 90%. And so again, we started to kind of put all these pieces together and say there's this really clear kind of way to access education if we can get it through a mobile phone. The huge challenge then becomes, how do you actually teach someone something meaningful in such short sound bites, especially something like messaging, right? And so that kind of brings me to my next point of, how do we actually teach someone something accessible? And we had to think about, do people actually want to learn over text message, right? And so we got a group of about 100 students together. We found some texting software online and started to manually text just different groups of students. And the thing that was really fascinating is we texted them some entrepreneurship tips every day. I mentioned to you all I was running a public speaking coaching agency at the time. We texted them a lot of public speaking coaching tips and best practices and those sorts of things, and tried to formulaically build kind of learning modules and courses that way. And again, what was really fascinating was when we compared it to, excuse me, to video e-learning, to microlearning apps, when the students were surveyed after, most said that by a huge margin that they enjoyed text message courses far more. And so for us, that was kind of enough validation there to say, okay, there's clearly something here. If we can find a meaningful way to teach over text message, then we can increase the access here. And so, this goes back to the core question: how can we help millions of people like Mohammed to really learn effectively? So for most of e-learning history, frictionless access and this idea of anyone being able to learn anything they want in a similar format like this has been nearly impossible. And so again, when we were thinking about how do we actually, build and put together some sort of messaging-based or really short-form learning method, this is what it looked like. So the first big piece of this was smaller learning engagements. And so when you look at Go1, they're a big learning and training company. Their state of learning report, they said, look, 49% of learners said they don't have time to learn at work, but 94% said they see the, even career benefits of making that time to learn. And when surveyed, when you see how different learners across different geographies reacted, in this sense, they mostly preferred, bite-sized learning engagements. Additionally, we do know that spaced learning works. And so we started to research, how do we actually get people to learn something meaningful and then remember that over a longer period of time? And so again, we space things out across 1 to 2 months and increase knowledge retention up to 50%. And so again, we're starting to put together these pieces of what should this messaging-based, this training-based learning module look like. And we said, okay, very short form and very spaced out. We're to check 2 boxes there. The third one was really just around text messages in general. And so we were really inspired by Susanna Loeb, who's a researcher at Stanford that's well regarded. And this tips by text program that actually came out, all the way back in 2014 around increasing behavior change for preschoolers and for parents. And again, this was kind of another of one of the main focuses of this project was, okay, we need to be able to create learning that's not just short forms, not just space out so people remember things, but that they actually take or do things differently as a result of the learning. And that was the biggest part of thinking about behavior change if we're actually going to design a new learning model. One, both that's accessible, sure, but also that just works much better than a lot of learning models that are out there today. And finally, this was a study from the University of Pennsylvania, bridging the intention and action gap. So they had done a text message program more recently about trying to bridge the gap between when I'm thinking of doing something, when I want to, usually happens all the time in learning, and then when I actually go and do something differently as a result of that learning, which that part happens very infrequently in learning. And so this is what we came to after all of this research and after all of these different needs we had surveyed, was about a 2 screen length or 1,200 character concept or case study message. And so it looks just like this. This is what an average text message learning day looks like now or came to be. Essentially, you would get some sort of visual learning piece, about a screen or so or two on a smartphone. If you were on a non-smartphone, it would have a pretty similar interface. You can have a link. If you do have internet access, you can click out to it and watch something more, but you don't have to. It's just a link, so there's no actual extra data or anything carried in there. And then you can amend responses to it. And so you can have learners text back, and then you can preset responses, kind of like a very simple chatbot that are preloaded in as a result of responding to this type of learning. And so again, when we think about all of these different methods of learning and really where they're going, another question I get all the time is, okay, we've got these methods that teach someone over text message. Where are they going? How do they work? And for us, here's what we think about, especially as people even increase their access to internet and why this is still such an important way to learn is because it will really transform the lives of people like Mohammed and people like ourselves too. Stepping back, there's really three major shifts we think about that will define this next decade. The way we work, the way we train, and the way we learn. And so for the way we work, people are often much busier due to hybrid work. There's less in-person time for training, video fatigue, or people watching videos and having to go through these long webinars is really, really high. And there's just a large increase in communication tools, as it's more important than ever that people need to communicate, especially during COVID and when things are remote. It becomes really difficult to do this. The way we train, again, same thing. Change is happening just really, really fast. The way that people learn and train is rapidly shifting every day. Upskilling and reskilling are not one time, they're happening continuously. And then as the world changes faster, the content needs of people do too. And so what I mean by that is, okay, COVID-19 safety comes up, or different trainings that we never thought about come up all of a sudden. And it all of a sudden becomes really, really important and crucially important to actually be able to have ways that people can spin up content rapidly and can go through it and can finish it, as opposed to just creating something kind of in its own sandbox and then launching it out when it's done. And finally, entire workforces, populations, whatever that might be for you, they really just need to learn far, far more rapidly, because that's the reality of the world that we're living in. And finally, the way we learn. So again, we like to say we have an 8-second filter. That doesn't mean that people have an attention span of 8 seconds. It means that within 8 seconds, and this gets smaller every generation, we decide faster and faster whether or not something is worth our time and attention to listen to. And so, there's much more of an appetite for authenticity, for informal learning experiences. Everyone, everywhere, regardless of where they are, their internet access, is really getting a smaller atomic unit of learning. And so when we say that, what we mean is the smallest soundbite that someone can actually learn something meaningful in. Greatest example of this being many folks use things like TikTok or Twitter, and they're just these quick hits of things where we'll learn something. And so again, that atomic unit of learning is getting much, much smaller, and that learning is happening everywhere. So a few new challenges ahead. Like I mentioned, with all of these in mind, the first becomes access. So whether it's if you have internet in your country, a learning management system, if you don't, laptop or internet access, right? But those are not a given, even for folks who might be in a country that has that broadband internet on a widespread scale, but has folks who are on their feet all day, right? If I run a shop or work in a restaurant or in any sort of frontline employee, warehouse, manufacturing, what have you, internet is not a given. And so that becomes the first big problem. The second one becomes reinforcement. As I mentioned before, this being crucially important and something that all of learning, regardless of internet access or not, is facing a lot right now, is just our action behavior change actually happening as a result of what someone's learning. The third thing becomes immediacy. So just building and deploying content really fast. Like I mentioned, there's all these challenges, all these shifts that come into place of things that are, they haven't happened yet. And so we need to do this incredibly quickly. And the fourth is time and engagement. And so learning that makes time for people and is really easy to love and to enjoy and to consume becomes a huge part of all of this. So again, for our organization, we like to say that learning should happen on the communication tools that we already use. And so what I challenge all of you to think about are the things that we think about when we think about friction or buying someone into something. You can either use all the methods that have been created from scratch, create something entirely new and put all this effort into getting people to go use it. Or you can say, okay, where is everyone currently? How can, wherever learners are, whatever access they have, whether that's just on their cell phone, whether that's in a workplace setting on a Slack or on their phone like a WhatsApp, we should have learning happen on the communication tools that we already use. Because at the end of the day, that's the most low friction way to actually meet someone, to get them to engage with something and to get them to respond, because it's in an instance where they already are. And so existing tools really are the most powerful modalities. To the problems I just spoke about, for access, it's accessible to anyone, and there's no either learning management system, broadband internet that's required. Reinforcement, so it becomes perfect for that bite-sized reinforcement, taking those actions based on things. Immediacy, courses being built and launched, even by those on the ground. And so as I'll show some examples for you all in a minute, but regardless of where you are, how many languages of the populations you serve, you can get these things out the door as quickly as possible. And then time and engagement. And so things are quick, they're hyper engaging, and it doesn't require long attention spans to go through this or to actually understand it. So a few course examples, and I'll make sure to leave plenty of time for questions as well. A few course examples of what this actually looks like in practice. And so the first one is with the Thompson Foundation. They had deployed a 5-day training to 1,200 journalists in Sudan. This was covering what is COVID and who is a vulnerable population, the dangers of misinformation, ethics and standards to uphold, and different tips for content production. So the director of innovation of this organization said text learning helped us 3x enrollments and 5x completion rates, and it was really easy for us to set up. And so again, this is a good example of what we see with this type of learning modality, is that we can actually pack everything into just an image of some kind, some short or long form explanation or walkthrough, and something that's just very short and to the point. And as you'll even see with my presentation, we believe in things that are just shorter, that are more condensed, because brevity allows you to control what people actually remember. If I speak for 2 hours and you listen to the entire thing, you might remember 10 to 15 minutes of it. If I speak for 15 to 20 minutes, then I get to control what you remember. You probably remember 8 or 9 minutes of it. And so again, those are some really important things to think about when we look at how these types of learning modalities work. So in this case, they said text learning helped us 3x enrollments and 5x completion rates, and it was really easy to set up. The next is with COVID-19 health and safety training. And so Pyramid Learning had deployed a 7-day training to the Naki Valley refugee camp in Uganda. And so they will be covering things like, safe hand washing and hygiene practices, social distancing, mask wearing, best practices for keeping the community safe. And so again, this is really crucial to think about, because at the end of the day, when we pack things into these just short sound bites, they become so accessible. And so for this one, the course actually went viral in this community. And for them, they said, okay, people are immediately washing their hands. They're immediately sanitizing or doing social distancing best practices. And so they had said, the course was very resourceful. The first lessons even helped them to sanitize the community, especially the water point. This was right as COVID was happening. And so again, it shows you just how even changing methods completely, changing methods of teaching and methods of distribution really allow us to increase the access someone can have to something that's just short form and far more accessible, like WhatsApp, right? And so at the end of the day, these folks were a lot more safe. They were a lot more involved because we weren't afraid to go outside of the mediums that we're so familiar with, like an in-person training, which couldn't happen because of COVID and because we couldn't get boots on the ground. Another good example here, and the final example here, is police training. And so we worked recently with the Association for the Prevention of Torture to create a WhatsApp course in Madagascar. This followed things like, arrest best practice logs, being more humane when making an arrest, and adhering to reporting guidelines for inmates. And so they said the reality of Madagascar is that internet is very sparse. They even mentioned it's very poor, especially, or even for police officers in this instance. Through text-based learning, they're able to reach these different groups who are geographically just in rather remote areas. And so again, this was really crucial for them because they just had no access to any sort of internet. They mostly just had WhatsApp, and they needed people to, that idea of action, that idea of behavior change, to very closely take actions differently for different types of trainings. And again, as I show you this course examples, whether it's police training, whether it's journalist training, or whether it's COVID-19 and health, the most important thing is that the future of learning isn't about making things smaller. It's about making learning intentional and more human-centric. And we always get asked, oh, well, is it just taking current learning and squishing it down? And the answer is no, not necessarily. Again, we want to think about how we actually design trainings and make them more intentional so that people will take action or do something differently as a result of them. And for us, we want to do that using accessibility and being able to reach everyone as a filter everything goes through, not as kind of a nice to have, oh, if it happens to be accessible, that's better, right? And so it took a lot of time and effort, but we really believe that we've designed a better just way for anyone anywhere to learn, whether that's abroad over things like WhatsApp or SMS or whatever country you reside in, if that's WeChat or Line or Telegram, right? Or even if you're in the office and on office messaging, and it's things like Slack or Microsoft Teams that have become so prevalent too. So we believe that learning should happen in all these places, and making it smaller and more bite-sized is just making it more intentional and making it more human-centric, and finally making it more accessible. So all of this comes into a new era for learning. bite-sized learning moments that are seamlessly embedded across the tools that we already use. And we believe that this is really the future of all learning and the future that all of us should push for when we think about how to build really effective learning experiences. So final, quick things I'll show you all here. I always get asked kind of what this looks like. For our team, we started our company several years ago. We're now a team of several dozen and work mostly with Fortune 500 or global nonprofits. But this is essentially what a lot of this looks like is, concepts or case studies that are packed in. I can go build it here in some sort of an interface, add different questions, and this comes out looking like this. Okay, this was about, for students, how to set priorities. Here was a prioritization matrix. Here was how to use a calendar, create a to-do list, right? Build one of these matrices. And so all really important things where I can rapidly create my content, and then I can see the output here. And at the end of the day, we could even measure things like, okay, our completion rates, our progress rates, our answer accuracy rates and response rates. And so this is something really important to do as well, because when we measure this level of analytics and this level of detail across a broad range of geographies, learning tools, when we actually give access to everyone, then we can start to learn what's going on in people's lives. How do we adjust learning accordingly, just based on what they're learning? So with this new approach, we can genuinely make learning accessible, effective, and like I mentioned, not just smaller, but really, really human-centric. And today, to kind of wrap it up, Mohammed, who I mentioned before, who's originally a student in Yemen, now holds a job in the nonprofit sector. And a lot of that is because of just increased access to education across the board. So for us, we think about him every day, and folks like him, and our work is really just beginning. So for leaders like yourself, or for even students like yourselves, you'll be at the cutting edge of just this transformation ahead of us. So here is to making a difference. So thank you all so much. We'll make sure to leave plenty of time for questions as was promised. Again, if none, no worries. So to try a course, you can head to courses.arist.co. And then if you actually want to chat with us, we always allow folks to book a time with our team if they want to just learn more. So you can always go to arist.link/chat. Finally, if anyone wants to reach me, my email is just ryan@arist.co. Again, a lot of what we do is messaging-based training, so feel free to reach out at any time. So thank you all so much, and I'll stay on for a few minutes in case there's any questions.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. Okay, Open Zoom has a question. It says,
Sure. I'm happy to answer them right from the chat if that's easier for you, Aiko. Awesome. Perfect. So this one, from Oman Zoom says, what does the text learning look like right now? What countries do you work in currently, worked in the past? Great question. Globally, probably about three or four dozen countries now. And so on nearly every continent, we've done training programs in sub-Saharan Africa. So, places like Kenya and Tanzania. India is one of the most popular, and so different regions in India that texting is very difficult in India, so it's all primarily WhatsApp based. Different parts of Europe and of South America. We recently did a lot of financial literacy training in places like in Costa Rica and in Ecuador. And so again, we see these trainings all the time. For us, we create kind of the systems of distribution that allow nonprofits to just come in and to use these tools, and our expertise is just in the technology behind it. But we always think about, again, going back to that idea of, how do we make this a truly accessible platform? And so we can support things like multimodal languages, right? And so we've done courses in Korean, Arabic, Mandarin, English, Spanish, French, about 24 languages to date as well. And then with what does the program look like right now? Typically, we will just give platform access to people on the ground. And so if I'm, with the COVID-19 example, as a good one, there was an organization that had about a team of about 1,200 journalists in Sudan. They had used a similar kind of program. They had set it all up themselves. We give a lot of the content, or they can also build it themselves in the interface that I showed, and then they can deploy it to all of their learners and then have real-time analytics based on what I had showed there. And there's another great question in chat here. What subjects teacher were you again? Great question. So the organization I ran before did a lot of public speaking training and coaching. Specifically, when I was in Tanzania, I was teaching entrepreneurship. And so both the business in and outs and best practices, accounting and bookkeeping, things that are not as commonplace there. And then also just a lot of kind of the presenting, how does entrepreneurship work in different countries and those sorts of things. So awesome, fantastic questions. Pakistan or UAE, we have deployed courses to the UAE. Pakistan, I'll have to check, my team can keep me honest there. But if the longer answer I have for you is that if you are using WhatsApp to reach the users that are in those countries, then it's entirely possible to use the software. Awesome, perfect. If any other questions, feel free to let me know in the chat. And like I mentioned, you can always head to arist.co or courses.arist.co to take one. How are students' performances assessed? If there's interrupted internet connectivity, does this form of learning serve the purpose? Again, both fantastic questions. Performances are assessed by a number of ways. And so we can track completion rates, retention rates, response rates, answer accuracy rates. Typically, when you go in to build the course, you'll set these parameters for what do I actually consider a complete course? Are these responses optional? Are these ones mandatory, right? And then we'll assess that just based on if they either got the number of correct answers right, or if they accurately did something differently as a result of doing this. A good example of that is for a lot of hygiene and sanity training. We had gone back and said, okay, you have to tell us to make sure that this was actually sanitized. You have to text back once you've washed your hands, and they, so that's how we measured completion, and that was just by a simple response. If there's interrupted internet connectivity, how does this form of learning serve the purpose? Again, a great question. And so, a good way to think about this is that for text messaging or for WhatsApp or messaging based learning, we don't need continuous internet access. We just need if it's SMS, some form of cell service. If it's WhatsApp, just kind of the lowest level of internet bandwidth once per day or every few days. And so we can get the learning there because it's all text-based. It's very, very, low latency data versus if we were to send lots of, let's say, videos or something more heavy like most e-learning programs, then we're going to need consistent and really strong internet, which those are the two things that most folks don't have, is internet that's consistent or internet that's strong. We've had a lot of users even just walk to an internet cafe a few times a week, when taking these types of courses. If they're in really rural areas, they hold up their phone to something, get internet for about a minute, they get their messages, and then they can read them on the walk back home. And so again, we always think about what's that lowest kind of latency way to do that. Great question from here. Has this program been affected by the pandemic itself? Has there been a surge in demand for it? Quite transparently, yes. Everything shifted from in-person learning to remote learning. I think a big focus for our organization is we originally were focused around, how do we create a lot of the tools and processes to better support a lot of in-person learning and better support folks who are moving online and learning that's moving from in-person to online. And so the pandemic didn't really change any of our large level goals. They just completely accelerated this. And the future of education at large was accelerated by, probably about 10 to 15 years just by these trends. And so again, that was something that we were just kind of on the cusp of when that happened there. How difficult was it for you to teach students from different countries and having different languages? Again, another great question. So different countries, not as challenging. Again, there's a lot of different self-sign-up portals. We even can do things where we said, okay, here's a list of student WhatsApp numbers. They're across all of them, about 70 countries. We can upload all these WhatsApp numbers, and then the program will automatically send a WhatsApp message to each of these people. And so different countries, there's no problem at all. That you can actually treat them the same just because of how automatic and scalable a lot of that is. As far as different languages, the way that works is we actually do this manually. So we have translators in-house. We'll just copy programs, copy, in this case, text message course content across. And then because same thing, it's text-based, a full course is probably about the length of, let's say, a long article or a few articles. And so it's actually not that hard to translate. And so we had worked with the state of California recently. We did a lot of natural disaster preparedness training and wildfire prevention training. And that course had gone out in a dozen different languages. And so we just had people on staff copy everything over, translate those into the necessary languages and then deploy those out. And that took about a week. So again, speed is kind of a thing we really emphasize because most of these trainings are things that the longer you wait, the more people are going to, potentially not know something that could either save their life or just help them a lot. Awesome. Of course. Yeah. Thank you for all the fantastic questions. If you all have more, again, my email is just ryan@arist.co. Please don't be shy to reach out. Awesome. I will, I'll hang on for another few moments in case there's any other questions in the chat. Yeah, great question. So currently, our team is growing pretty quickly. We do a lot of work in the US around training Fortune 500 organizations, and then globally training with nonprofits or different school systems or organizations that don't have access to the internet. And for most of them, we'll actually donate a lot of services in kind that are funded by organizations we work with here in the United States, where I'm based. And so, a lot of what we're expanding to now is just different messaging apps. And so WeChat, Line, Telegram, or ones that Slack, Microsoft Teams, are ones that we're releasing very soon. And a lot of this, again, is really just about getting the acceptance of remote messaging-based learning to the world, and really something that's just far more accessible. And so, right now we're a team of about 20. We're growing pretty rapidly. So as far as expansion, that's how we think about it there. We also rely pretty heavily on a number of just large nonprofit partners to reach different groups. And so they've been good at helping us connect with different countries or organizations who might need this. Awesome. A few other great questions here. Minimum number of texts per day to complete a course. Typically, the better way to think about it is it's about 4 or 5 screen lengths of content. It might take me about 10 minutes per day. So that can be 2 texts. That can be 7 or 8 texts. I'd say 6 or 7 is probably the norm there. Ideas on how to integrate this form of learning for promoting entrepreneurship education. Again, a great question. One of our first courses was an entrepreneurship course. And so we had tips through text that were things like, okay, let's, if I had to explain venture funding very simply, or I had to explain how to make a great sales pitch or how to do bookkeeping, right? If I could only explain this in about 2 paragraphs, what's the best way I would do that? And then I had to give you a small project to do every day, right? And that form of learning is conducive to almost everything. And so when we say, okay, that's a way that someone can learn, let's try that for bookkeeping, let's try that for pitch practice, et cetera. We can use it for things like entrepreneurship quite successfully, actually. And I could even have someone say, okay, I want you to go sell these 3 things and register this with the country that you're in for a formal business, and then do this by the time this comes next week, right? And so we can prompt them to go take those actions because of this. Text can be long and heavy to read and stay engaged. How do you handle this challenge? Another great question as well. We think about keeping things really short form. That's why in the example I showed you, you'll see emojis, you'll see different line items, different lines skipped, an image if someone's bandwidth can afford it, right? And so we think about using lots of emojis almost as left lines, like fancy bullet points, because they break up the learning a lot. They keep it really fun and really engaging, versus if we just give someone a big block of text, they're going to click out, they're not going to read it. And so a lot of those practices and those visuals are based on just tons of research. At this point, we've delivered a few 100,000 courses, and it's just based on a lot of our analytics around what works best when those sorts of things are happening. Awesome. Again, all fantastic questions. Folks always have tons for me, so always feel free to reach out to my email as well if you'd either like to chat or just have any more questions. Perfect. Of course. Thanks so much. Awesome. Perfect. So thank you all so much again for taking the time. Aiko, at this point, I'll probably stop sharing the screen here. Thank you all so much. Amazing questions, really engaging, and thank you again. Again, if anyone has questions or other things you'd like to chat about, I will throw my email here in the chat one last time. Perfect. Great. Thanks to the Unimpact team. Thanks again, Aiko. And again, hope to hear from you all soon.
Thanks for coming, everyone, and thanks for presenting, and thanks for all the questions. We only have like one or two sessions left, but if you want to register, I'll put the link in the chat. And there's also a help desk if you have any questions or want to know more about this. So I think this session will end now. Thanks for coming, and have a good day.
You too. Thanks so much.
Thank you.